acceptance that I can turn this water into a bottle of Four Cousins.
Well, that was a subtle change. I didn't talk about water into wine. I talked about vodka into water. And you missed, therefore, entirely the point. That was a bit of evidence on the empirical level that God can change people. Now, I want to take up several of these points. You said, without a shred of evidence, I assert a God behind the rationality of the universe. Okay, let's deny the existence of God. And I often have this conversation with my colleagues. What do you do science with? They say, my brain. The cuter ones say, because they don't believe in mind. My brain. I say, what is your brain? Well, they say the short story is, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I say, and you trust it. That, to my mind, is an absurdity. Now, Thomas Nagel has just written a book which you're probably aware of, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. And he has pointed out, much to the consternation of the new atheists, that we've been brilliant in reductionist scientists in science because we've left out the mind that's doing the science. And he makes the point that it has hit cyberspace like a nuclear bomb, that if the Darwinian account were right, we'd never know it because it undermines rationality. Now, this is something that goes back a long way. So when you say there's not a shred of evidence, one of the way of testing hypotheses is to deny them and see what they lead to. And I would want to contend on this, the rational intelligibility of the universe, that it's atheism that leads to nonsense. In other words, what I'm doing is not establishing a mathematical proof, but an inference to the best explanation. One more point I want to address. You said that talking about science and rational intelligibility doesn't get us to the Christian God. Absolutely right. The New Testament concedes that. And that's why I said, when it comes to the God of the Bible, I have evidence from ancient history, from experience, and so on. I agree with you entirely that we don't get to the Bible. Now, the final point on the water into wine, which is now mentioned twice, and Richard Dawkins mentioned to me, he said, I know the sort of God John Lennox believes in. He turned water into wine. And I'm afraid it was slightly frivolous, but I'd make the point again. I said, Richard, you know, if Jesus is the Logos, the Son of God that created the universe, then he created water. So perhaps making it into wine wasn't a big deal after all.
Eusebius, let me ask for your final closing thoughts on this, because we got to move on and say something about morality.
Okay, yeah, so just a couple...
This is fascinating indeed.
And the morality question I'm very keen to get to, because you will discover that John and I share a view on morality that's quite interesting. But just some final remarks on this. We don't have time to go into it. It's not the heart of today's conversation. And John generously has invited me to continue engaging in beyond this forum, and I will. I still think that there is a lot more work argumentatively that John needs to do to be compelling on this point, that me trusting my brain and my rationality is an act of faith. I think the use of faith there... Yeah, this is a House of Commons, apparently. Of course, the use of faith there, John, on your part, is an equivocation on faith. There's faith as in belief in the teeth of the evidence, without looking for evidence, where you just believe as a matter of trust. Nje, you might say in South Africa. That's one sense of faith. Sorry for non-South Africans watching on YouTube. And then, so that is not the kind of faith that I have in my rationality. The kind of faith I have in my rationality is the kind of faith he has in mathematical certainty when he does proofs of mathematical theorems, where I subject claims, either if they are observable claims, to verification, falsification, or in the event where we're talking about values-based conversations, which we're moving to next, then of course they need to be subjected to the criteria for sound argumentation. What are your premises? Do they support your conclusion? Do they do so sufficiently? If it's not that kind of argument, if it's based on inference to the best explanation, is it really the best explanation? Are you not taking on too much? There are some pretty clear criteria, independent of mystique about my brain being amazing. Independent of that. that I can use as yardsticks for making sense of claims about the universe. That is not faith. That is a methodology that John himself is deeply committed to as a mathematician and as a scientist. So to describe that as faith on the part of the rationalist is, to put it mildly, I think, to use the word faith in a way that is designed to pretend that it has the same meaning in that context as it does in the context of those believers who are not like John, who are happy to believe in God on the basis of faith and don't care for apologetics. That person who uses faith in that context has a kind of faith that is very different to the rationality that you have so generously acknowledged that I'm displaying.
Can I comment on that?
No, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to move on, Professor John. We do need to move on. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, as you realize, same time next year, the extended version on the existence of God, featuring Professor John Lennox and Eusebius McKaiser as they continue to engage. But surprisingly, to me at the dinner table this evening, I found out that both of them believe in the existence of objective moral values. Now, let me start with you again, Professor John. You believe in the existence of God. You believe in the existence of objective moral values. What is the connection between morality and God?
The connection between morality and God is that God is the ultimate ground of our being and therefore of our morality. Now, Eusebius and I both believe, we have faith in, and I simply think that you have fallen prey, sir, to the postmodern concept of faith, that it means believing where there's no evidence. I regard my trust in God and rationality as both evidence-based, and you've just given the reason for you, but we go into that another time. But let me come to this. You see, my connection between God and morality and reason and morality is not that I do not believe that there's a rational justification for morality at the level of argument that's independent of belief in God. Now that I think we need to be very clear about, because you got that wrong in your newspaper article that you wrote about me before you talked to me. Because you said you disagreed with me about this connection, and then you said you held an incompatible view that there's a rational justification for objective moral truth. I believe that as much as you do. That's what we call natural law. That's a very deep and important part of the thing. And interestingly enough, the Bible itself talks about nature, the natural world, teaching us things about morality. I agree with you on that. And in fact, reading through your thesis, I found myself in tremendous agreement with a lot of the arguments. I said, this is marvelous. Here's a fascinating character who claims to be an agnostic or an atheist, and he's giving me a lot more reasons for believing in absolute moral values. So, building on that, it seems to me the connection, Eusebius, is simply this. For me, it's not either or. It's not God or reasons for objective morality. It's that God gives me the reason for believing in objective morality. So I connect the first part of our discussion with the second. You trust your rationality correctly to give you moral values. I trust God to give me the rationality that gives me the moral values. Great. Because if you believe there's natural law, I would say you've got to believe in God to get nature in the first place. That's where the deep connection is.
I hope that was the clapping of the atheist listening very carefully to a fatal concession that John made there. Otherwise, you weren't listening very carefully. I am a moral objectivist. I do not believe that in order for me to explain to you why rape is morally wrong, I have to make reference to God. I do not believe that. And the key question is, can you privately give yourself an explanation for why rape is wrong without reference to the Christian God? There was a timed grammatical pause. And that is the basic view that I wanted to bring to the framing question tonight. Is God necessary at the level of justification for understanding the wrongness of the rightness of a particular moral fact? Now, John was delighted that both him and I think there are such things as moral facts. I'm not a relativist. I think it's one of the biggest dangers sociologically in the world right now. But I think John was, if not puzzled, it's very well read, may have come across people like an Immanuel Kant, who can give you an account of the categorical imperative without necessarily having to refer to a deity, let alone the Christian God. Now, there are two parts here to the discussion. And I concede in the spirit of the wonderful, honest rapport that we're having, that there is a difficulty for people like myself in philosophy, in academic philosophy, especially when we speak to non-philosophers. It's really difficult to give you a simple, straightforward, in plain English, an account of moral objectivity, because we all use moral language in everyday discourse, on radio, on Facebook, on Twitter, and we all think we're experts at ethics. We don't need to go and study moral philosophy. So I'm going to put it very simply, because this part of my burden is in the heart of the framing question, which is whether God is necessary. For me, it's very simple, that I can look at the world. John was referring to sociological facts about human beings that are fascinating commonalities, and I agree with him. That is the kind of ingredient that I use as a philosopher from which to build an account of the rightness and wrongness, the desirability, undesirability of certain kinds of behavior between human beings. In general, none of us like pain. In general, we like happiness. Happiness is too simplistic in philosophy. We might change it to other concepts so that it doesn't reduce to just hedonism or pleasure. But we kind of know human psychology. We know the kinds of things that make human beings more rather than less content. We use that, we add to it a couple of basic principles, like a commitment to consistency in your reasoning and not being happy with arbitrary justifications. And then it really will take us no more than 10 minutes, if we spend the time on it, to make a link between that methodology for arriving at moral facts and understanding why the Constitution has the right to equality in it. It's also the reason why I abandoned law, because it's not interested in exploring more fundamental questions about the moral justification for why the right exists. But in cashing out that right, which is the main thing I used in my master's thesis, it is quite easy with a mixture of basic commitment to consistency in reasoning, plus facts about human psychology, and we can make a lot of progress in moral dialogue without reference to God. I'm going to park that. What I will acknowledge there, especially for any professional philosophers, that there's a lot of hard work to be done there. But the question that is the framing question for tonight's discussion, there, I'm afraid, I really think that John has the more difficult side, because he has to tell me not just that he regards God as the source of his rationality, which in turn allows him to account for why rape is wrong. All he is saying there is that mechanistically or descriptively, God features in a story of how he came to have the ability to reason for himself that murder is wrong. What he didn't say there, which is the concession I was referring to, that you might have missed if you were applauding affirmatively, is that by saying there's no deep difference between us, there is. Because God can be eliminated as not necessary for the justification to fall or stand of why murder is wrong. The most that God is needed for in John's life is as a medium to access what can be independently described as right or wrong.
All right. Thank you so much. Eusebius, let me, before you respond, John, I just do need to ask a question, just so that we bring it down again. Are we using the phrase objective moral values, in a sense that there's a moral, say, prescriptions that are free from human opinion, so they would be true even if no one in the room believed them to be so? Are we using it in that sense or a different sense?
Look, for purposes of this discussion, I think we can be fairly generous, whether you want to talk about moral facts, moral objectivity, universal moral principles. I mean, John and I can broadly agree. Any of that language can do. The important thing is, John and I both think it's not up to you to say, as a matter of, I feel it's okay to rape a baby, to make it morally permissible. Him and I share the view that certain rules, it is morally wrong to rape a baby, is a rule whose truth and whose command power over you as a member of the moral community stands regardless of your personal sentiment. That is what I mean by objectivity, and that's what John means. Where we depart is that I don't think I need to make reference to the Christian God in giving you an account of why that rule is a rule you should comply with.
Thank you. John.
It's very interesting because the difference is small and it's great at the same time. You see, you said all that John can say is you need God to give an account of your rationality. But your total faith is in your rationality. If you didn't have it, we wouldn't be having this discussion. So bringing God in at that level is not all I can say. It's utterly necessary to the discussion. That's point number one. Point number two is, of course, we can give an argument that rape is wrong, just using reason without mentioning God. But that's a very different thing. We're working in a world that was created by God, and the very reason we've come to that conclusion, I believe, is because we're made in the image of God. But now, if I go a little bit deeper, and you've challenged me to, I think there is a problem. You said, look, we can all see that human flourishing has a value. We can't all see that. Now, if I'm a Hitler, and I decide that flourishing for me is to get rid of the Jewish population, what are you going to say to me, and what are you going to ground the values? Well, what have you to say to me? I'd be very interested in that, because what the God, bringing God into it, which for my mind is intellectually absolutely necessary, otherwise it leaves your faith and your rationality is ultimately blind. It has no grounding, so it is blind faith of the kind you don't like. That the God dimension is grounding that rationality and morality in a transcendent direction. And one of the things I noticed, and I'd love to hear your comment on it, Eusebius, what I notice is this: in the West for centuries there has been a God dimension to morality. Now there is an utter desperation on the part of many philosophers and scientists. They've got rid of the vertical, so you try to get morality from in this world. Now you are quite an exception, and I'm delighted, actually delighted you're such an exception, because many of the people I meet are desperate to ground morality in genetics or something like that, you see. And of course they get in a mess, because Darwin looks at ants, there's altruism, Spencer sees the struggle for the survival of the fittest, and we all know where that has gone historically applied morally. So my problem is, if you simply say, it's my reason that tells me that, how do we deal with the extremes in this world, the Hitlers in this world, the ISIS of this world, going around beheading people? I'm just asking you that as a matter of interest. I don't think it's an easy question.
No, it's not, but I do have some responses. I've thought about it a lot. So let me say a couple of things. Firstly, on the idea of the relevant sense in which God is inextricably bound up with an account of why rape is wrong, is that without the generous rationality that he confers on John Lennox or Eusebius McKaiser, you'd not be able to come to that conclusion yourself. I think John is making there, I don't mean this as a swipe against you, I mean it as an intellectual claim, is making a fairly elementary error there, which is that even if I grant you the existence of the Christian God, including the fact that he confers on both you and me, the rationality capacity that in turn enables us to reason. And if he didn't, so I'll even grant you this, I'm a very generous agnostic, that if God didn't exist, which would be a nightmare for us, that we may not have the rationality to be able to come to the conclusion that raping a baby is wrong. So I'm giving you all of that. But the elementary mistake you're making there, John, is the following. It's the equivalent of saying, and I really mean this analogy, that my mom, bless her soul if she's in heaven, she was a believer, that my mom is inextricably bound up with my rationality, because had she not given birth to me, God forbid I wouldn't exist, and in turn, I wouldn't exist with the capacities to be able to reason about philosophy, normative questions, etc. Well, my mom might have a role in the story of how I came about. That is not the sense in philosophy in which she is needed to describe on paper why murder is wrong. If I said to John, I'm forcing you as homework to write me a 500-word essay without reference to God, why equality as a value matters, why murder is wrong, why female genital mutilation is wrong, he will pull it off. He knows he will. So the contingent account of God being generous enough to have given him the ability to write the essay is interesting at the level of knowing where his reasoning capacity comes from. It does absolutely no work epistemically, because the moral facts that he will write those essays about, he'll be able to give an account of without a reference to God. Allow me one more response, John, to your question about Hitler. I don't think it's actually a difficult question. The reality is that there are limits to who I can engage, you can engage as a Christian philosopher, and there are limits to who I can engage as a moral objectivist who is not a theist. If you don't identify as a member of the moral community, as it were, if you were a psychopath, if you were a sociopath, for example, then of course I can't reason with you. So there are limits to what I can say to a Hitler. But now ask yourself, does the fact that I cannot persuade Hitler that he is wrong in his moral reasoning, does it follow from that I have to appeal to God? What are the chances of that succeeding? I'm not sure they're any greater. So very little follows from examples of evil in the history of the universe. Because the questions, and again, this is where I really look forward to meeting John, because we share this view about the limits of evolutionary theories that try and explain morality. Evolution can't force us to not ask questions, how should we behave? At best, they can describe how we actually have behaved. And that's why I think it doesn't get us very far in moral reasoning. But citing me a shopping list of examples of people who are evil, and I can do the same about people who are Christian, is utterly not salient in the context of this debate, because my inability to make progress in getting Hitler to not continue with extermination is not evidence that there's an intimate connection between God and morality.
Well, let me respond then to that. Firstly, I thought of the analogy of your mother too, and I was going to use it. Because that is precisely the point I'm making. You said it does no epistemic work. It does epistemic work before the discussion starts. And I'm not disagreeing with Eusebius that we can't write a 500-word essay giving reasons. I'm not disagreeing with that in the slightest. But where I might disagree, and I'm not sure I want to go down this road because it's a huge debate, I think there may be a fallacy in your logic, though, that you're doing what David Hume said you mustn't do, and that is you're going from is to ought. And as I look at that, I see that as a massive problem. You are arguing that ultimately you can get morality from your observation of facts. So you're moving from facts to values. And I disagree with David Hume about many things. But it seems to me he's got something very important there. How do you move from facts? You could say that to values. You can observe effects, but you've got to do the bridge. And as you know, there are many philosophers, like James Rachels, for example, whom you quote quite frequently, who realizes there's a massive difficulty. Now, it seems to me that the fact-value distinction is very much like the non-rational distinction. I don't think you get from one to the other without an input of intelligence from outside, from God. So that's the first point I would make. Now, I mentioned Hitler rather awkwardly, and I apologize for that. What I'm really getting at beneath it is this. You believe in moral absolutes. Do you believe in ultimate justice? You see, from where I sit as a Christian, one of the great problems I get as I move around the world is facing people who are screaming for justice and never will get it. And if you look at the vast majority of people in this world, they don't get justice in this life, however much we fight for it. And if there's no judgment by a rational, loving God, they'll never get justice. And the thing I want to say is, whether Hitler believes it or not, or the ISIS people believe it or not, I think the fundamental teaching of Christianity that there's going to be ultimate justice is the thing that validates our conscience. And therefore we have hope, at least I have hope, to bring to people who are in a situation, and I often meet it, that they will never get justice. And the ironic thing to my mind is that atheism here, and I know you agree with me about atheists, but here the atheist position removes all hope of ultimate justice. We fight for justice in this life, that's wonderful. So let me rephrase that question. You believe in moral absolutes, yet you don't believe in I notice you use moral facts as distinct from natural law. And I suspect that's deliberate, because using the term natural law means that you believe that there's a lawgiver. I believe there's a lawgiver who will ultimately be a judge. Now that dimension is totally missing, is it, from your worldview?
Winston, can I have 1 minute before we engage?
I'm sorry.
I know you have more than 1 minute just to...
Okay, yeah. So a couple of responses. Hume is one of my favorite philosophers. Fell in love with him in first year and remain in love with Hume. You are totally right, of course, that there's something dodgy going from descriptions of how the world worked to saying that that's how it ought to be. That's not what I did. So while I accept your description of what Hume is warning us against, that is not what I said at all. What I'm very happy to say, I don't have perfectly worked out. And if I had to return to the academy full time, I would spend work on this area in moral philosophy, is making more sense. And that external examiner from UKZN that gave me a distinction, bless his soul, I think might have overlooked some weaknesses here that I'm happy to acknowledge in my MA thesis. That it's very difficult to give a really good account. And if any of you can, if you are budding philosophers, please do help me out, so I'll go back and plug the holes in my thesis, of how we get from descriptions of what people like and don't like, pain, pleasure, etc., to saying things like everyone is entitled normatively to equality. So I take that point completely. It's not what I was suggesting. I did my best as a young philosophy student to try and make that connection, drawing on others who've written about it. So I deny the accusation. What I was trying to do there, John, is not quite accusing you of the same thing, but I was trying to point out a structure of some of your arguments that is a pattern in the way in which you engage on these topics that I've now noticed. You are the one, ironically, that relies a lot on lived experience, descriptions of history, sociology, contingent facts about the world, and then a couple of minutes later, crank out God's existence. That is actually a much better case study, if I was a lecturer, of how someone goes from descriptions of the world they've lived in, descriptions of their personal experience, and then cranking out a massive conclusion. The Christian God exists with attributes that are not actually attributes that we routinely see in the world around us. I think you've got a bigger problem there. What? The other point that I wanted to make just on this is that of course, the fact that I might have difficulties as a non-theistic philosopher trying to come up with an account of moral facts that don't make reference to God, it doesn't follow from the shortcomings of my project, the struggle of that project, that you're on stronger turf. No way, you still have a hell of a lot more work to do. And you haven't done that work here today. Because what you need to tell me is why the kind of problem that an atheist philosopher who believes in moral objectivity faces, going from descriptions of human psychology to claims about how you ought to behave, you need to tell me what the argument is for gratuitously inserting the Christian God as a solution is justified. And you never do that work. I find you at that point a little bit assertive in the sense that it's almost saying, if the Christian God existed and the Christian God had the following attributes, then these problems in moral objectivity for the atheist moral objectivist would fall away. But that is like saying you should therefore commit to the role of the Christian God in moral objectivity because it plugs certain discomforts intellectually that you are saddled with when you are trying to explain to Hitler why it's objectively wrong to kill Jewish people. But you haven't made the argument. You've just said, if God had these attributes, God would be a solution. But I've yet to have the argument for that. There was a final point that I want to make, but it just eludes me currently, so I'll stop there.
What we'll do, thank you so much, Eusebius. What I do want to do is engage the audience a little bit on the discussion. Remember, you can take a moment now, please, if you have a question, to send through the hashtag CapAm.